Welcome to Fault Line Files. Today, we're jumping straight into the declassified paper trail of the 1953 Iranian coup. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here for this explainer. We're literally pulling back the curtain on a massive 20th century turning point. And we're not dealing with rumors or speculation here. No way. We are taking a magnifying glass directly to the once highly classified internal documents from the CIA and the State Department. Right, let's kick things off with this completely startling admission from British intelligence. It perfectly hooks us into the hidden motives. This quote, it's from MI6 agent Monty Woodhouse. Back in late 1952, Britain was furious. Why? Because Iran's incredibly popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had just nationalized the British-owned Anglo-Iranian oil company. But the British knew the Americans wouldn't stage a whole coup just to save British corporate profits, so Woodhouse explicitly admits to playing on America's Cold War paranoia. It was a totally calculated pitch to frame a battle over oil as a crusade against global communism. And honestly, that brings us to the million-dollar historical question. Who actually orchestrated the fall of Iran's democracy? See, when the dust finally settled in August 1953, the official story was this. A spontaneous, popular uprising by the Iranian people swept away a dangerous prime minister to save their beloved monarch, the Shah. But today, we're strictly analyzing the internal documents and declassified communications to see what really happened behind closed doors and how it completely contradicts that official narrative.
Section 1. Motives. Oil versus communism.
Okay, to really understand how this went down, we first have to unpack the competing agendas of the US and Great Britain. What's super interesting here is how the CIA's own clandestine service history plainly lists both the financial oil settlement and the anti-communist crusade right side by side. This is a direct excerpt from a highly classified 1954 post-mortem report. Look at the text. The explicit goal was to install a government that would reach an equitable oil settlement and vigorously prosecute the dangerously strong Communist Party, which was known as the Two-Day Party. Internally, they didn't even try to separate the corporate interests from the geopolitical ones. So while President Eisenhower was terrified of a communist takeover by the Two-Day Party, the British were just laser-focused on getting back their Anglo-Iranian oil company. Eisenhower's administration had adopted this very active foreign policy, and with the Cold War raging, the fear of losing Iran to Soviet influence was incredibly palpable. But British intelligence officers, guys like Woodhouse, they knew exactly which buttons to push in Washington to get the CIA on board. And boy, did they commit serious resources right out of the gate. The CIA set aside a massive initial budget of $1 million. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to about $12 million today. And that was just to lay the groundwork for the overthrow. This money funded a covert network codenamed Baydam. Baydam generated intense anti-Mossadegh and anti-Soviet propaganda, targeted members of parliament, and essentially just primed the Iranian public for a sudden change in leadership. Section 2. Blueprint for a coup. So the crucial point here is how they actually planned to unseat the incredibly popular Prime Minister Mossadegh. The American operative on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt, and yeah, that is the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, he knew they absolutely needed the Shah's signature on a firman to legitimize their actions. Now, the Shah's power had basically been reduced to ceremonial status at this point, but a royal decree, that would give the military an excuse to follow orders. It was all about creating this thin veneer of legality to completely disguise what was in reality a foreign-directed coup. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact paper trail we're following. It's a highly classified postmortem written just months after the operation while memories were still totally fresh. This report, penned by the CIA's Dr. Donald N. Wilbur, was drafted specifically to capture lessons learned for future operations. You know, for decades, the U.S. completely denied involvement, but documents exactly like this one, they prove the meticulous, systematic planning that went into the overthrow. The plan was totally multi-pronged. It relied on a highly coordinated strike of psychological warfare, royal authority, and pure military muscle. The idea was to pressure the hesitant Shah into signing decrees that dismissed Mossadegh and installed a pro-Western military man, General Fazlollah Zahedi. Meanwhile, they'd use that CIA Baydam network we talked about to whip up the streets into a frenzy. Honestly, it looked perfect on paper. Section 3. The August 1953 timeline. Okay, let's see how this perfectly crafted blueprint immediately spiraled into absolute chaos. This day-by-day ticking clock shows a frantic few days where the official US and UK narrative completely fell apart, before suddenly, miraculously succeeding. On August 15th, they executed the plan, but Mossadegh was tipped off. The military strike failed. By the 16th, the terrified Shah had fled the country entirely. Washington actually thought it was over. But then, by the 19th, in this stunning reversal, Saadi was suddenly in power and Mossadegh's home was in ruins. So how on earth did that happen? Well, let's look at the failure first. The CIA's own documents admit that a leak in the Iranian military completely compromised that initial August 15th attempt. The chief of the Shah's bodyguard, the guy sent to arrest Mossadegh, was completely overwhelmed by superior armed forces who were still loyal to the prime minister. The element of surprise was totally gone, and it forced the Shah to flee, first to Baghdad and then on to Rome. But fast forward to August 19th, and as the agency's own typed retrospective directly confirms, CIA station assets helped ignite the massive street protests that ultimately toppled Mossadegh. Remember, the official public narrative for decades was that the Iranian people spontaneously rose up in outrage. But right here, in the CIA's own internal document, it explicitly states, and I quote, "Station political action assets also contributed to the beginnings of the pro-Shah demonstrations. The agency wasn't just observing from the sidelines, they were deeply embedded in generating the unrest." Even the president privately acknowledged the hidden American hand in pulling victory from the jaws of defeat. In his private diary, President Eisenhower noted the U.S. role in the restoration of the entire situation. So, publicly, the U.S. government was celebrating the Iranian people's supposed democratic will. But privately, they were taking credit for a spectacularly successful, albeit incredibly messy, covert action. Section 4. Scripting the Sovereign. To see the starkest contrast between the public lie and the hidden truth, we just have to look at the Shah's supposed vacation. While the Shah was telling the press in Italy that he hadn't fled, that this was nothing else but a vacation, declassified telegrams show CIA Director Alan Dulles literally choreographing the Shah's public statements right from Washington. The U.S. Embassy in Rome was absolutely panicked by the Shah being there. So what did the CIA do? They literally cabled over a script. Seriously, the State Department and CIA needed the world to believe this was a constitutional Iranian action, so they wrote the script for the monarch. Look closely at Telegram DIR 1622-5. It instructs the ambassador to urge the Shah to use this specific line, that his action was not in any sense a coup d'etat, and that he had no choice but to remove the head of a government acting unconstitutionally. The architect of the coup was dictating the sovereign's defense, word for literal word. And to solidify their new government, the CIA didn't just use words. They used a staggering amount of cash. $5 million. Right here in the declassified file, we see the immediate financial reward handed to General Zahedi. Why? To ensure the month-end payrolls were met and loyalty was thoroughly bought. The document plainly states that the CIA covertly made available $5 million within 2 days of Zahedi's assumption of power. Think about that. They had removed a popular leader, installed a military general, and now they had to basically float the entire country's payroll to prevent an immediate counter-revolt. Section 5. Blowback and Legacy. We really cannot look at Operation Ajax without examining the explicit historical blowback documented in our sources. Actions like this, they resonate for generations. Sure, the immediate goals were achieved. Western oil companies returned to Iran, with U.S. companies now getting a piece of the pie alongside the newly renamed British Petroleum. But the cost to Iranian society was devastating. To maintain this new regime, the Shah, with outside assistance, established the brutal Savak secret police. Opposition parties, including the Tudeh and the National Front, were completely crushed. And because this was seen as a massive success back in Washington, it became the exact playbook for future covert overthrows in places like Guatemala and Cuba, completely blinding the U.S. to the long-term resentment it was breeding. By removing a democratic leader to install a brutal monarchy, this covert operation laid the incredibly volatile groundwork for the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The anti-Western sentiment birthed in 1953 directly fueled the hostage crisis, severed U.S.-Iran relations, and absolutely set the stage for the profound mistrust driving today's perilous nuclear standoff. It's wild to think it would take over 50 years for a U.S. president to publicly acknowledge America's role in this coup, long after those unintended consequences had drastically reshaped the entire Middle East. It leaves us with a really critical question about the true cost of covert action. The documents we explore today show the incredible lengths powerful nations will go to in order to secure their geopolitical and financial interests. I mean, right down to drafting a foreign leader's press statements. But they also show that you simply cannot control the long-term historical forces you unleash. When a foreign power scripts a nation's destiny in secret, who ultimately pays the price of the blowback? I highly encourage you to keep exploring these declassified files to uncover the answers for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next deep dive.